Bonjour and welcome back. Today we continue our exploration of US political history in the late 19th century by looking at the dominant political movement of the Gilded Age, and that would be the conservative movement. First, what is the Gilded Age? Well, that would be the period after Reconstruction, which ended in 1877, so kind of after the after effects of the Civil War, but before the next period, which is a progressive era, which you could date from the time that Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. So the last decades of the 19th century. So what was notable about the politics of the time? Well, not that much in many ways, because the federal government was weak. A lot of the things that we take for granted today, like say Social Security, the income tax, a large army, Medicare, Medicaid, all these big ticket programs of the federal government did not exist back then. And instead you have a very slimmed down kind of government, and that meant that many of the presidents would be far weaker than they are today. Nowadays we have what is called an imperial presidency, where presidents amount to emperors. Not so in the late 19th century. In fact, you would have a hard time figuring out who those presidents were. Did you know the list of presidents from 1877 to 1901? Well, let's check. Here's a little pop quiz. Do you know who that guy there, the white guy with a crazy beard? No? What about that white guy with a crazy beard? Who is he? What about that white guy with a crazy mustache and sideburns for a change? Oops, we're now up to mustaches only. Who is that guy? Oops, we're now back to beards. Who is that guy? Well, if you don't know, don't worry. I have taught the class a million times, and I don't know who they are either. I always have to get out my old cheat sheet to remember who everybody is. Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison. These were the 5 old guys that you looked at. 4 of them Republican, 1 of them Democrat, and that would be Grover Cleveland. Notice the dates for his presidencies. He was president once, was defeated, and then came back 4 years later to be elected again. That would be so far the only president ever elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. And that's about the extent of what I know about Grover Cleveland. Why don't we know that much about them? Well, in large part because there's not much to know. The office of the presidency was much weaker then than it is today. And if you don't believe me, listen to what Woodrow Wilson has to say about that. He later became a president himself, and we'll study him in detail. But initially, he was a political scientist, and his big book was something called Congressional Government, and the title kind of says it all. That in his mind, the federal government was dominated by the big barons of Congress, and the presidents, who, remember, the executive office is not the first article in the Constitution, the legislative chambers are. Well, the presidents would definitely be a secondary aspect of the federal government, especially at that time. What about Congress, and do they do much? Well, not that much, because this is an era where there's a very sharp divide between Democrats and Republicans, and the nation was pretty much split 50-50. In many ways, the Gilded Age resembles our time, when there's also a much partisanship between the 2 parties, leading to gridlock in the Senate and the White House and the House of Representatives. And people were very partisan back then. To be a Democrat or Republican is more of a state of mind, or your friends are from the same party, your family was from that party. You vote publicly. You don't actually vote in secret. You get a ballot from your party and you bring it in public to the polls. Everybody knows that you're voting Democrat or Republican. So it's really a club, a lifelong commitment to one party, and the nation is split roughly 50-50. And in fact, many of those presidential elections that you have there are decided very closely. In some cases, you have cases of electoral fraud that throw the election one way or the other, or elections where one person loses the electoral college and somehow gets elected. So in many ways, quite similar to what we have today. Recently, we've had 2 presidents elected president while losing the popular vote, but winning the electoral college. So just for the sake of being complete, what are the main issues that agitate Congress at the time? Well, one big one is the tariff. How much of a tax should you have on foreign goods? And the answer largely is a high tax, because conservatives are all about protecting domestic manufacturers and they don't like foreign competition. Next time we'll talk about the populists, the farmers in the Midwest, and they were up in arms about that. They didn't like how high the tariff was. The other big issue is the railroads, which are being developed back then a lot, because that's the main method of transportation in the same way that interstates or airplanes would be today. And in that sector, the conservatives, who generally were against big government, were actually in favor of big government. They actually gave a lot of federal land to companies in exchange for which they were supposed to build a railroad. It was kind of a sweetener to induce people to build railroads, especially in the American West, when there's a lot of distances, sparse population, and it might not make economic sense to build railroads. So huge tracts of land are given to railroads, and then after that, once they have built the railroad, they hope that people will come, and then you'll make money through selling real estate that was given to you by the federal government, not the actual running of railroads. What's another big issue? Well, paying the pensions to Civil War veterans. There are still a lot of them around, and that's actually the main expense of the federal government back then. Another big issue economically is how do you set up the US dollar, the currency itself? Should the US dollar be fiat money, F-I-A-T, meaning that people will accept paper money based on the trust that they have in the federal government? Or should the paper money be backed by something more tangible, a precious metal like gold? Well, in the late 19th century, the gold standard is the norm. You can actually go to a bank with your paper money and say, I want the equivalent amount in gold. And this way people have trust in the US dollar, and actually remained a system up until the time of Richard Nixon in the 1970s. That's another thing that the populists will complain about, because that means that money is rare, interest rates are high, inflation is low, all of which is good for bankers. Well, the bankers are conservative, so they're happy with that. Not so the farmers. We'll talk about them next time. Another big issue is the so-called spoils system. And back then it was normal that if you became president, a whole coterie of people who had supported you during the elections would come with you and then try to get jobs in government that were well paid. And that's part of the reason why the elections are so hard fought. There are all these people that are hangers-on and want a job as quartermaster general or postmaster general or something like that. The spoils. To the winner goes the spoils. And things got pretty bitter, so much so that one of the presidents that I showed you on that slideshow, President Garfield, was actually shot by one person who had hoped to get a big job after the election of Garfield and was somehow disappointed. He is one of the few presidents in US history that were shot. First one had been Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. We'll see McKinley being shot pretty soon. Spoiler alert, and double spoiler alert, something bad might happen to John F. Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. People were shocked enough when that happened, especially that this was something as silly as just somebody wanting spoils from the election, that an act was passed called the Pendleton Act, which is creating a civil service, that by now to enter the civil service, at least the regular positions, not the high appointed ones, you need to have some qualification, and those people will be picked based on their training and their apolitical nature, not the fact that they're party hacks connected to the new president. That Pendleton Act is still in the books, and that's why nowadays we have a somewhat more competent bureaucracy than was the case back in the Gilded Age. So the conservatives are in charge and the government doesn't do much. That's the first step. What about conservatism in general, then and today? And there you might pause the video for a second and ask yourself, what is it that makes you a conservative, meaning roughly a Republican today? Well, generally, conservatives today believe in low taxation, including for the rich, a small government, with the exception of the army. Currently, conservatives like to spend money on defense, and they tend to agitate themselves over more cultural issues like abortion, race, affirmative action, the place of God in politics, prayers in schools and such. And the conservatives of the late 19th century had some overlap, but not completely. The cultural issues were not very central to them. When it came to the army, they didn't like to spend money in the army, so they were for a small defense establishment. But the one area where conservatives of the 1870s would be in agreement with conservatives of today is that they liked a small government. That was the essence. They embrace what is called laissez-faire, and I love it because it's a French word that is used in English. It simply means let people do what they want, that the government should stay out of people's business. That means that taxation should be low because the government should not be stealing your money or stealing the money from successful people. And if they take money, well, then they spend it, and that's bad. And that the government should not pick winners and losers. That should be free enterprise where people compete in the capitalist industry and let the best man or woman win. So ideas that go back to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776 in Scotland. If you had been a young boy growing up in the late 19th century, the kind of books that you would have read would not have been Harry Potter. It would have been books by Horatio Algier, who was a very successful publisher of novels for young boys, Strive and Succeed, and many others. I've read a few of those. They all tend to follow the same formula, where you start with a young boy who doesn't have that much money, he might be an orphan. He has a job from a very early time, as early as maybe 12 or 13. He's a newspaper boy delivery, or he works in a local grocery store. But he's hardworking, never complains, never goes on strike, and eventually is entrusted with a whole store and then sets up a new line of business. It's kind of a message that is sent to young boys. If you want to be a good American, it means to be a financially successful American. That's how you judge people. Which, in a way, is surprising, because there are many ways that you could judge people. You could say this person is good because that person is a good father or mother, or is a very intelligent person that has many intellectual achievements to his or her credit, or that's a moral person that abides by the 10 Commandments and other norms of virtuous conduct. Well, in the Gilded Age, and remember that gilded comes from gold, from money. If this is the era of money, you are judged by whether you are successful financially or not. And that's true even of preachers. Russell Cornwell was one of the famous preachers of the time, and his most famous sermon, which he delivered thousands of times, was one called Acres of Diamonds. And you can easily find a copy of that online. What is that sermon about? Well, it tells people that to be good in the eyes of God, you have to make money. And if you die poor, you die a failure. Not just a failure among your countrymen, but a failure in the eyes of God, which is a bit crass coming from a man of the cloth, but that was a very successful sermon. And we have some remnants of that. If you ever listen to televangelists asking you to send them seed money, look it up if you're not familiar with the concept, you'll see that there are still branches of Christianity that associated financial success with godliness. Well, not everybody succeeds. In fact, you have a large gap between the rich and the poor in the late 19th century. So the question is, what happens to those who fail? Well, they are called in the late 19th century the undeserving poor. And the expression is a bit confusing. By that I mean people who don't deserve any help, not people who don't deserve their fate. They fully deserve their fate, according to conservatives. If you are poor, it means that you were too dumb to succeed, or too lazy, or a drunk. It has nothing to do with luck. You were poor because you deserve to be poor, and so you're undeserving of any help, which is kind of different from the way that a lot of people who look at poverty nowadays. People would say, well, this person is poor because they didn't have an easy background. They grew up in a trailer park, or I lost my job because the economy was bad and my factory closed down. Well, that's definitely not the attitude that people have in the late 19th century. They think that everybody's responsible for their fate, that America is a land of boundless opportunity, and if somehow you fail to succeed, it means there is something wrong with you, especially if you're a man. So how could you improve things? Well, that's where the whole concept of eugenics comes along. You might have heard of the term eugenics in connection with the policies of Adolf Hitler in the 30s and 40s in Germany, when he tried to eradicate all those that he thought to be inferior human beings. Mentally disabled people, gypsies, gays, and of course, Jews. Well, the concept of eugenics actually goes back way before Adolf Hitler, and it was very present in the Gilded Age in the United States among the more powerful classes. The idea being that some people succeed because they are better, intrinsically more intelligent, and those who fail are somehow weak, need people who don't have the intellectual capacity. And so the best way to really fight poverty would be simply to let people die. Do not give welfare aid to the poor that will allow lazy, dumb drunkards to survive. It's best to let them starve to death. And that might seem very harsh to them in the first place, to see a worker, his spouse, his kids starve to death. But in a way, it's a way to clean the gene pool, to get rid of people that don't have the mental capacity to succeed. Some advocates of eugenics thought it would be best if 10% of the population was wiped out in each generation, and then little by little you could improve the human race in the same way that you would breed horses together, or animals like dogs, and that's how you improve the gene pool. But you apply that kind of Darwinism, but to human beings. This might seem like an extreme ideology, but it was very much in vogue among the upper classes of the late 19th century. One famous case involved that young lady, Carrie Elizabeth Buck. She came from Virginia and had kind of a difficult childhood, had been abandoned by her parents, raised by foster parents, raped as well, abandoned by her husband. And eventually she was sent to the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, kind of an insane asylum, even though she was not insane. Apparently her foster parents were ashamed that the rapist in that case had been their nephew, and that's why they had her committed for being, quote, feeble-minded. And under the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which sounds like the kind of thing that Hitler would do, but was actually an act in the Commonwealth of Virginia, she was forcibly sterilized so that she would not breed more and have more children that would be feeble-minded like she was. She was not an idiot, far from it. That was just the state's opinion of her, largely because she was poor and so she was assumed to be dumb. Well, she was smart enough to appeal the decision, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. And you might think that at that point the Supreme Court would decide it would be wrong for the state of Virginia to forcibly sterilize its poor under the pretense that they are, quote, feeble-minded. But in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court actually condoned the decision. In the words of one of the Supreme Court justices, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. She came from a poor family and it was best to extinguish that line right there and then. If you're interested in that topic, I would recommend reading the book War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. Quite an illuminating story. Some of the things that I have presented may seem quite harsh to a modern-day audience, like letting poor people starve to death or sterilizing them under the theory of the undeserving poor. What kind of theoretical justifications could people offer for that? Well, they turn to social science, specifically biology. 1857 is the time when Charles Darwin in England had published The Origin of the Species that put forward the whole theory of evolution that still dominates biology to the present time. And some conservatives then took those ideas that applied to how animals compete in the jungle, the survival of the fittest theory, and applied it to human beings because we are animals, we are great apes. And so that led to the concept of social Darwinism that would be embraced by people like William Graham Sumner and Herbert Spencer, thinkers that were either in Britain or the US, but the idea was especially popular in the United States, especially among the upper classes. The idea being that for the human race to progress, we need to have some level of competition. And sure enough, sometimes gazelles get eaten by lions in the African savannah, but that's the only way that gazelles can learn. And you want to take them out of the gene pool and only have gazelles that can outrun the lions, and ultimately the next generation, the gazelle will be better and faster. Well, let's do that with human beings as well. So that's why they are against any kind of welfare aid. It's a way of not interfering with nature and the survival of the fittest. Beyond that, one way to correct some of the worst aspects of that cutthroat competition would be philanthropy. It comes from the Greek word. It means basically to love mankind. You might translate that as charity. One of the more famous Americans in the late 19th century was Andrew Carnegie. He came from Scotland originally, and he was one of these rags to riches stories that you might see in a Horatio Algier novel. He became quite rich in the steel industry and eventually became a multi-millionaire. As a conservative businessman, he was definitely against any kind of high taxation, welfare aid, and the like. But he was also a man of conscience who thought that something had to be done to help the poor. He was the author of The Gospel of Wealth, again a book that you could find online, in which he argues, and I'm quoting him here, that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He thought it was important for the rich, before they died, to give all their wealth to some type of charity. Why would he do that? Well, in a way, it's a form of redistribution, and Carnegie was very worried about the specter of communism, the fact that if the rich did not do something to help the poor, then the poor might revolt and you would have a communist uprising that he wanted to avoid. Argument number 2 for him was the fact that his children should not inherit his wealth because he believed in the fact that everybody should succeed on their own merits. It was not normal for the children of the rich to be very rich simply because they were trust fund babies. So he wanted to donate all his money and tell his kids, now succeed on your own. Conservatives during the Gilded Age were very much against any form of taxation, with one exception, the inheritance tax. That's the one that they liked a lot. Some conservatives went as far as to say that the inheritance tax should be set at a level of 100%, meaning that all the wealth left at someone's death should be confiscated, the reason being that every new generation should fight on their own and make their own money. I have compared the conservatives of the late 19th century to those of today, and there is a distinction there. The present-day conservative movement tends to be opposed to the inheritance tax, even calling it the death tax, and so there has been a complete 180 on that particular issue within conservative circles. So how do you give the money? Well, you give the money not as a form of charity. You do not write a $100 check to every person in America. Instead, you want to help the poor help themselves. So most famously, he created a network of Carnegie libraries, which you still have today in the town where I live in Louisiana. There is a Carnegie library. There's probably one in the town where you live. And the idea was that indeed there are inequalities between the rich and the poor, in the sense that the kids of the rich can go to fancy prep schools and universities and get the best education that money can buy, and that gives them a leg up in the survival of the fittest world. So to help the poor help themselves, you would have all these free libraries, get a book for free, educate yourself, and you have a somewhat level playing field when you enter the workforce later on. To help the poor help themselves. The whole notion of philanthropy is one that we still have today. A lot of the wealthy people in America today tend to have their wealth inherited from their parents, but you also have people that had succeeded in their lifetime. People like, say, Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, among the richest men in America. And many of them have a tendency to think that they should not leave money to their children and instead should donate all of that to charity, especially education or to fight against disease, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The idea being that most of their wealth, or maybe 99% of it, would eventually be given to philanthropic causes. And only 1%, just one tiny little $1 billion will go to their kids. I think Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, has made a similar pledge. So you have some distant legacy of that philanthropic thrust of the conservative movement, which is quite admirable even today. Beyond that, to justify why the government should stay out of business, well, just turn to classical economics, because all the main thinkers of the late 18th and early 19th century, and many of them are from the British Isles, keep arguing that the best way to have maximum economic output is for the government to stay out. The most famous would be that Scottish economist I mentioned earlier, Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, and is the one who thought that the best way to organize the economy was to not organize anything, and it might be chaotic, but it would be as if by magic some hidden hand of capitalism behind the scenes would adjust prices through the law of supply and demand and such. Another author that is quite relevant would be Thomas Malthus. And he argued that it's impossible to raise the wages of the poor too much, because if you raise the wages of the poor too much, then they buy more food, they are healthier, and they start having a ton of kids. And so the next generation, the population balloons in a way that is a exponential kind of growth. That if you have 6 kids and each of these 6 kids has 6 kids, you could see that after a few generations, the population of the world would double and then double and then double again. Whereas the food that is produced for agriculture might only grow by 1 or 2% a year. So ultimately, you'll have a big gap between the population that has ballooned and the food production that has only grown incrementally. And that will lead to a Malthusian catastrophe, pest, famine, and pestilence. So if that happens, then you will have such a big famine that the population will plummet and then get all the way back to something that is more sustainable. And so that means, one, that you cannot have wages that are set artificially too high. They should be set by the law of supply and demand, basically at the subsistence level, just enough to keep your workers alive, not more, otherwise they will breed like rabbits, not less, otherwise they will starve to death. And that means that the federal government should stay out of setting a minimum wage, because there is no minimum wage in the late 19th century. It also means that you have a justification for the fact that there are so many poor people in America making so little money while the rich are making so much. It's just a way of keeping the population of the poor down. So you can use all these theories, and that justifies conservative views. So that's it for the conservative ideologies. There's not much else to say because it's all about not doing things, staying out of people's affairs, limiting taxation, limiting government intervention, except maybe to build railroads, and beyond that, let private enterprise, the barons of industry, the Andrew Carnegies of the world, do their magic. Let the hidden hand of capitalism take the steering wheel. Well, not everybody was happy with that conservative ideology. There were people who thought that there were things that were wrong in US society and ought to be fixed. Two of these groups would be the populists, who are farmers who want to fight against the gold standard, and the other main group would be the progressives, who want to fight to protect the poor and eliminate corruption and preserve American democracy. These will be the topics of the next two lectures. Au revoir and goodbye.